Om Parusham Artam Shunyanam Gunanam Pratiprashavaha Koivaya Swarupa Pratistam Vachati Shaktihi Iti Om Shantihi Shantihi Shantihi. That primal Shakti force responsible for returning, transmigrating consciousness back to its source, and for rendering nature devoid of name and form, accomplishes and neutralizes both, and the ever-sentient soul achieves its final emancipation. Om peace, peace, peace. Om Sahana, Om Sahana Vavatu, Sahana Bunaktu, Sahavirdam Karavavahai, Tejasvi Navaditamastu, Ma Vidvi Shovahai, Om Shantihi, Shantihi, Shantihi. May Brahman protect us, and may Brahman sustain us, and may Brahman illumine our thinking consciousness. May we not find fault with each other, with the world, or with the teachings, and may what we study be a source of inspiration to us eternally. Om peace, peace, peace. May peace be unto us, and may peace be unto all. Om Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om Tat Sat. So with those two shlokas, one a peace chant from the Upanishads, and the first one I did, maybe some of you recognized, from the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, affectionately known as the father of yoga, that 8-limb system called Ashtanga, or Raja Yoga, the kingly yoga. That's the final sloka of the whole collection of shlokas, the final of the fourth pada, and it has to do with the mention of the Chitti Shakti, the mother of our thoughts. And I used that here at the fourth and final class of our 4-part class series, of which we had number 3 last Sunday. And we're concluding today that series. I use it because we'll have to necessarily dip into a little bit of teachings on yoga, that is, union with Brahman by Patanjali. And sometimes the system is called Patanjala, named after him. It's, I think, the only one of the systems in all of India that got named after its founder or its composer or conceiver, because yoga, of course, has been around much longer than the father of yoga, who is probably 140 years AD in that incarnation, because we look at Indian rishis and realized souls as having many incarnations, some of them traceable, but unlike Tibetan Buddhism, where they have really been tracing them more and more in these days and times. Indian rishis never put a great emphasis upon that, but of course more upon just the teachings of reincarnation, birth, life, death, so-called, and rebirth, 4 movements of that process, which, if it's done unconsciously, as in the case of billions of people probably on this earth, because few ever got the teaching of the Dharma or rebirth in their lives in this age. If it's done unconsciously, then there's this ignorance to bear, and this suffering comes out of it. Avidya, ignorance, is the first of all the pain-bearing obstacles. Klesha is a Sanskrit word that yoga mentions in his yoga system. And yoga is one of the most superlative of all systems by which to conduct a successful spiritual life. It is really a transformation of the mind in all its levels of thinking and consciousness, which is why I chanted about may Brahman illumine our thinking consciousness right after that. But it's also has its advaitic element, which just means yoga, union, to be yoked to divine reality. as if one could ever unyoke the soul from its source, from its essence. It doesn't make sense to think that way. But it has its practice too, if somebody has forgotten that they're ever one with divine reality. If the soul falls into that cycle of rebirth in ignorance, where the Atman, or the Purusha, as he's mentioning here in the slokas, is forgotten. And so then a sort of divine remembrance has to take place. For those of you waiting for my next series of classes, because we'll end the will to live a spiritual life today, the next series will be, we've decided finally on the title, but it's going to be about Vismriti and Daiva Smriti, that is the role of memory in the mind, to recall. Yes, it's past lifetimes. That's not, it's maybe a penultimate ideal, but to recall its divinity, Daiva Smriti, that's what's missing, or has gone missing, in the intelligence of human beings in this day and age. So our systems of lower knowledge are not that intelligent if they've forgotten this source of existence, which is being overlooked, or as Sri Ramakrishna put it, buried under mounds of earth. Like everyone has gold inside of them, he said, that's the Atman, or this Purusha that Patanjali is talking about all the way back from Lord Kapil's times. But many people get this gold of their soul buried by mounds of earth. So mounds of earth would be rebirth many times, accruing too much karma, too much weight of cause and effect, believing in relativity and forgetting reality. There's different ways in which you can tell it, but it has many levels of forgetfulness. I guess one of the ways it's been put more recently is piling more gloom on gloom. If you have read and memorized Swami Vivekananda's Song of the Sannyasin, like all of us at SRV associations have done for decades now. It drags from birth to death, and birth to death, and death to birth to soul, this ignorance. And so it never remembers its divine nature. So we're going to have to look at some yoga teachings in accordance with our main chart. So we probably should get started, since this is our last hour and a half, in which to wrap up a very powerful statement. We must gain the will to live a spiritual life. So you can see there, as the chart appears before you, that we've already looked through getting a human birth. Hopefully you're born with the 5 yamas and the 5 niyamas intact. That is, ahimsa. Oops, maybe we failed there already. No, let's keep going. Ideally, hopefully you're born with the desire or the knowledge not to hurt anyone in thought, word, or deed would be best of all. Then one step up after human birth would be to get strength of body and strong posture, so you can sit like Buddha did for long days at a time under the bo tree, or Christ in the wilderness, Muhammad in the desert. Would have to have a strong body to forbear these austerities called tapas, which is again one of these niyamas that we just mentioned here. So if you're born with that, then your body is usually resilient and has strength already. And then the next level we talked about in the second class of this series, some 3 Sundays ago, was fundamental purity of mind. We looked at a couple charts about that. Chit Shakti, actually, Chit Shuddha is what we were talking about. So that purity of mind is one of the most coveted of all things. So right away you'd be thinking, it's not enough just to get a human birth. That's helpful. It's not enough just to have a strong body. But we're beginning to trace everything back to the mind already. The mind is the hub of everything, with its thinking power. So I didn't finish that statement a minute ago. If you do this rebirth process unconsciously, then forgetfulness sets in. That's called vismriti. But if you do this rebirth process consciously, drawing every breath consciously, doing all your acts consciously, serving God and all beings, all these great teachings that come forth from the Dharma, as it now presents itself to us, not only in ancient India forward, but even through Tibetan Buddhism and Zen and so forth, all traced back to Lord Buddha living there at Kapilavastu, the birthplace of Lord Kapila, so far and so long ago. So those Dharma teachings coming forth, then you tend to remember your connection with your previous births, as Krishna says in the Gita. So it's a theme that's coming up a lot now. Pretty soon all of these births will be erased from your memory as you attain Samadhi. We'll look at that very soon here. But that fundamental purity of mind comes right after body and strength of body. And across the board you can see how it goes together with life force. And then you come to this fourth and crucial, pivotal place, which you could mate up with pratyahara in yoga, that I might have a general inspiration when I'm young. One of the 5 types of yogis is those who aspire when they're young, but then they fail the goal. So that fifth or first, if you want, depending on what order you're putting it in, is a kind of yogi or yogini that always fails the goal, Father Vedanta says. And then there's one that uses herbs and elixirs and intoxicants to pretend that they've reached a goal. They always fail the goal. The third is one who does a mantra. They always fail the goal. That's painful to hear, isn't it? It means one who does the mantra like a parrot and hasn't connected breathing to it and teachings to the in-breath, held breath, out breath. We know about that because we've been studying this for 30 years, how important the breath and the prana and the psychic prana is to take us on this inner journey. So the will to live a spiritual life is going to be based upon this kind of resiliency of body, of energy, and of mind, purity of mind. If those are in place, then the will to live a spiritual life ends up with those other 2 kinds of yogis that the Father Vedanta mentions. Not the ones who just have an aspiration early on and forget, not the ones who take intoxicants, not the ones who do the mantra without faith and without knowledge, but the one that has a one-pointed mind through sadhana. It's called sadhaka, sada. It's the 4th kind of yogi or yogini that attains the goal in the end. And the 5th one that's just pretty much dissolves the mind because they already love God. They're already existing. They've come in to the process, not just with the human body and so forth, but purity of mind has been attained in another lifetime, or maybe they're just ever-perfect souls. Those beings are called Nityasiddhas. So this is the whole pivotal point of this class series, The Will to Live a Spiritual Life, which we're entitling this class series. And it comes from Shankara's 8 strata of attainment in the Viveka Chudamani. If you want to read that scripture, you can even write to me and take it as a course with me through these emails and through these mechanisms. That's open to all students. Open invitation. Then the 3rd Sunday we looked at the comprehension of the scriptures and how to transcend attachments. And then we looked at acquisition of discrimination, viveka. And that would give one or lend one to the attainment of perfect concentration. That's dharana in yoga. So this is all based upon Vedanta's look at the 8 strata and a comparison of how Father of Yoga and his teachings would go across the board with Vedanta's great axioms. So you can see there that that's straight across the board with the acquisition of discrimination, with getting this perfect unbroken concentration. Back when you had the breath as a practice, you wanted to have that. Connect your in-breath to your held breath to your out-breath. and that would be perfect breathing. But you'd have to keep it going, not just do it once or twice a day and then go back to shallow breathing again all day, or not study what A, U, and M means in terms of the in-breath, held breath, out-breath. That's Puraka, Kumbhaka, and Rechaka are the yogic terms for that. So all of these things are connecting knowledge to the practice, to the realization, and then taking it further. Once you have unbroken health, once you have unbroken breath, breathing process, you can get unbroken concentration of mind. So all of this is unbroken, what to say. It's connected at all times, and great souls go to their last moments, leaving the body, in an unbroken state of concentration. So more likely and most likely that they'll come back in that, with those abilities. So they will have daiva smriti, they will remember their practice in a previous lifetime. Not necessarily just every little thing that happened to them that was not all that important, but the practices they did will accrue to them in their divine memory and just come back as naturally as if you wake up and see the familiar things about your house. They wake up into this world and see all the familiar manifestations of Brahman. And everything reminds him of Brahman, just like Sri Ramakrishna taking village life and country life and city life and all kinds of life, and seeing Brahman there in all the examples of what people think and hear and touch and smell and see. All the senses become divinized. So we went to that, and then we went to the direct perception of the Atman, how to abide in meditation, with eyes open or with eyes closed, Holy Mother said. Both, you learn to see Brahman both inwardly and outwardly. And that brings us to union with Brahman. And so that's where we're going to have to talk about Samadhi and Yoga. So let's look at that next, so we can make the best use of our time. This is the 8th strata of attainment. So you can see where concentration and meditation have been gained after you've fixed yourself in a posture, I'd say a physical posture, a breathing posture, and a mental posture. All kinds of asanas, not just physical ones, but you fix yourself in an unswerving posture in each level of your being. And then you take the happenings of the world from that solid position, and then you can refrain from piling more gloom on gloom. In fact, you're destroying things as they come at you with the shield, with the armor of love, my teacher used to say. And in that way, you live your life in unbroken concentration, as we were just saying. So this takes us then into a study of Patanjali. Let's look at this chart. You can see there the image, very nicely put, of the hand strewing seeds. 2 hands full of seeds there. So we're looking at the seated Samadhis of Patanjali now, or Patanjala, named after Patanjali. He says the wisdom Samadhi, Sampragyata, is of 4 kinds. Attended by basic thought, that's called vitarka. Attended by subtle thought, vichara. Attended by sattvic bliss, ananda. And by the sense of I amness, asmita. So these 4 kinds of seated samadhis are leading up to what's called a sampragyata. We'll look at that as we course through this chart and reach that. 4 seated samadhis, but just 1 unseated samadhis, a samadhi. So there you see it spread out before you, and the definition of both. A sampragyata, transcendent awareness, which is formless, and a cognitive. It's beyond thinking, it's beyond mind, it's beyond intelligence. And I put there in parens the Advaitic equivalent to that. We call it nirvikalpa. In yoga, you could call it a sampragyata. Then the definition to sampragyata samadhi is the cognitive state of awareness in 4 levels. So in Vedanta, we'd call that savikalpa. The word vikalpa is there. The word kalpa is there. So whether you look at it in terms of thought, and you should, or look at it in terms of time, kalpas, then the idea is that the mind gets engaging in its thought process, time and space become real, and it projects senses and bodies into that. And then you have this process of birth, growth, disease, decay, old age, and death. Again, if it's taken from a conscious standpoint, is that you're willingly participating in this, knowing that the Atman is nameless, formless, deathless, timeless, spaceless, and that it's only Maya or Prakriti that's forcing this appearance of solidity and liquidity and homogeneity and so forth on the outside of things. And then you tend to remain ever aware of that gold inside of you, the gold of the Atman, not covered by anything. So it's good here then to look at how the coverings get torn away from one's consciousness. If one participates in seated samadhis only, that it's got to culminate in this asampragyata. How that happens is, and we are at the 8th strata here of attainment, remember, it's called samadhi. So Father's rather the great master of explaining samadhis in this unique way. So as far as savitarka and nirvitarka goes, you can see there the condition is accompanied by growth sat. That means you're focused on names and forms, and all of this is mixed with the gunas and shadowed by doubt. See, so the samadhi is as long as it's external only, it's beginning to strip away some of the overlays of Maya and help you see beyond nature, but this doubt lingers in the mind about whether this process is actually real. So it's not until you can examine at the savichara and nirvichara state that these doubts begin to fall away, and that's because of inward analysis, they call that. The aim of that lower samadhi would be to refine your concentration by focusing on objects, names, and meanings to lead to a fuller concentration or a fuller comprehension. So it's sometimes been laughingly or affectionately called samadhi with objects. So you're beginning to look at objects different than just what brings me pleasure or pain, and beginning to have an inner relationship with an object. It's beginning to show you the origin of objects, because you can't know an object out here. It's just, well, use a scientific example, it's just particles changing at a billionth of a second, many of them. So you can't actually know an object, you can just have a relationship with it. And that relationship often leaves you high and dry as far as fulfillment goes. And so this is why you're going to have to see the origin of objects and put together the name, the object, and what it means. And the method for doing that is knowledge of the world, knowledge of deities, and what's called the 16 visheshas. And we'll look at those as we're going along here naturally. So if you get to the savichara state of this, what we're calling the 8th strata of attainment, it's accompanied by subtle thought and focused on wisdom. So you might say the mind is beginning to change up and take its concentration off of just relative knowledge. It's called aparavidya, and it's beginning to focus on paravidya. It gets a real attraction to wisdom rather than knowledge, if you can make that distinction. And the aim of it is to transcend the imperfections of nature. These are what caused doubt earlier. One can't believe that nature isn't real and that the imperfections in the soul or in the mind are not real and that the Atman is ever perfect and so forth. So this is all it takes some growing into. And that's in order to perceive the subtle essence in things. This is what I just chanted in that loga. in that Yoga Sutra. Basically, Kaivalya Purusha Pratistam. You see, it's a steady, abiding state of the essence, Swarupa. So Kaivalya, freedom, Pratista, steadiness, Swarupa, essence. So you have the samadhi of knowing the essence all the time. And it's a fitting way in which all of these Yoga Sutras get concluded in the fourth pada. So that's what you're beginning to get an inkling of here now in this state of savichara, particularly nirvichara samadhi. The method for that, to try and comprehend the 6 avisheshas, and we're looking at those as we go along here. I mean, they're much like, of course, the 24 cosmic principles of Samkhya. And it's much like the dissolution of the mind stream, elements into senses, those into subtle senses and subtle elements, those into mind, those into ego, all of that into intelligence, buddhi. Then cosmic buddhi makes its appearance. Patanjali is more clearer about that, or at least mentions it more than Lord Copula did, the difference between ahamkara and buddhi as individual intelligence and buddhi as cosmic intelligence. That's one of these stations which you're coming to as you go inward. Now, he said that Sananda then is the bliss of this I-ness. And Sasmita is a finer point on it, but when you get to Sananda Samadhi, it begins to become accompanied by higher intelligence, focused on the subtlemost, enraptured by subtlemost causes of everything, and enraptured by sattvic bliss. And of course, anytime we hear the word sattvic, we know that's balance, but we know that it's something that is still gunically influenced. So we're going to want to go forward and go beyond that, as Sri Ramakrishna said. The aim here in this samadhi, then, that is, say, by having it, then one should be aware of the need to concentrate on the ego in a refined sense as the fount of all individual bliss, contained in the personal sense of I-ness. So this is where all impostures fall away. The ego, as Sri Ramakrishna would say, gets ripened, and it begins to have samadhi of the storehouse of bliss that was in itself, just like it had samadhi of the storehouse of knowledge and wisdom that was in itself earlier. So it's all about coming back to the self and knowing that all of these are coming forth. And so visheshas are origins to things. And you have to take all of these outer origins and just connect them and dissolve them, connect them right back into subtler and subtler causes and effects. It's all Satkaryavada. And yoga and Vedanta are in full agreement with Samkhya about that path of Satkaryavada, that there are causes and effects in this process, and you're seeking origins. So you want to make sure you don't stop short of the ultimate origin of things. Because Vedanta still has some very powerful thing to show you, is that everything, as Gaudapada says, is unoriginated. There is no origin to it. So there's a source and essence to it, an underlying substratum, but one just melts back into the other, dissolves back into the other until it's like icebergs, until there's just nothing but one body of water left. All the icebergs have melted back into their source. This is done, that is Ananda Samadhi. It's called Sananda. It means with bliss. It's done by transcending gross and subtle objects to enjoy this bliss of the ripened ego. So, first of all, you were enamored of outer objects, so you used it in a positive way. Then you knew that you had to leave off gross objects because they were weights on you. So you became enamored with their sources. And so the subtle objects now became more important. It's obvious to see people fall away from properties, objects, ownership, things like that, and all of a sudden fall in love with knowledge. You see, it's almost what our schooling is based upon, is to begin to love knowledge so much. And that is a natural way of seeing the source of objects. Just people in the West just don't put that together, that everything has come from the mind's thinking process. Chitti Shakti, the Chitti Shakti, the mother of our thoughts, will show us that, and we're coming to her soon. Then it comes to this four-seated samadhi. We're taking a little extra time on this because the 8th strata is very important. Obviously, just like the 8th limb of yoga would be important, it's called samadhi. So here we are looking at one of the great masters of samadhi and his system that's been centuries, long lived for centuries, and probably before that, and before his incarnation as Patanjali. The final of these 4 samadhis, which is, you can see there are actually 6 of them because savitarka and nirvitarka are divided into 2, and then so does savicharka and nirvichara are also 2. But basically we're looking at them as 4 samadhis. So the 4th one is sasmita. Asmita, of course, is I. So this is still with I. That's why it's still a seated samadhi. It still has that sense of I-ness in it. Obviously, wouldn't it? Because where Sananda left off, as it were, it was enjoying the bliss of the refined ego. And it's not like people getting all enamored of their personality. So they fall in love with their personality and they become full of themselves. I think they're full of something else too, but full of themselves. So I think that's what we say here. And when you take on spiritual life, then you find out that there's a source to this rascally ego that needs to be dethroned, and then there has to be something much subtler and more beautiful put in its place as you ascend these levels of the castle. I just thought about Shankaracharya's saying about there are 7 levels to the castle. The king dwells at the top. On the way, if you go up to 6 levels of this castle, which are like chakras, you reach all these grand officials and you think that's the king, that's the king, that's the king. But those beings just point you on to the top floor where when you see the king, that is the Atman, you have no doubt whatsoever that that is the king. And all these other officials earlier were just senses, ego in its various phases, intelligence, mind. So those are the petty potentates, see. But this one grand master of all is not a tattva, it's an abiding principle. So the change disappears. This is what's happening here as we look at it. So the method here is to meditate on I am in accord with the highest cosmic principles. So this is where you transcend the ego, finally, and unify meditator, act of meditation, and object of meditation. This is one of the great triputis of yoga and Mother India's way of speaking. You might say, putting together knowledge, the knower, and the act of knowing was already done in the knowledge samadhis. But now, here in the I am, that is, when you say I am, that means I am not that. I am not that last thing that I transcended. So it's not just enough to make an affirmation, as my teacher used to say. You have to confirm it, but you also have to say that you have left behind everything. You've sold those old pots for this one new pot. You've attained to the highest station that, as I just said, is unchanging. So transcend the ego to unify meditator, act of meditation, and object of meditation. And that's where you have then made your way through these 4 seated samadhis, sampragyata samadhi, taken pretty much as well as I could from the Yoga Sutras to explain it in Lord Patanjali's own way. So the 8th strata, union with Brahman, has come about, or is coming about. So we really were talking more about direct perception of the Atman, but now we're putting 7 together with 8, and we find out that union with Brahman is going to take formless samadhi, that is asampragyata, no seeds. And also called nirvikalpa, no time, no imaginations. Vikalpa is sometimes talked about in terms of cycles of time, kalpa. Other times it's talking about as cycles of thought in time. Kalpanika is the word in Sanskrit. So you can see how thought has been merging in its highest source, and meditation is going to help it dissolve itself completely. That line drawn on water that Sri Ramakrishna talks about is going to be erased completely in just a few instants. So that's what happens when the person has the first experience of non-dual awareness. So there it is right there in so many points, again, extracted from the Yoga Sutras, the process of nirodha leading to asampragata. So nirodha is, by the way, that fifth state of mind that I just talked about, where the mind isn't just one-pointed anymore. It's not just flat-lined. There's a line in a space and a line in a space, as we like to say, as far as a sine wave goes, a vibration of the mind. So the mind is dropping out on itself, and everything is dissolving, and the being is having experience of asampragata, then coming back to sampragata, having experience of nirvikalpa, then coming back to savikalpa in these days that go by, or weeks or months, in which this highest attainment, which he just called here kaivalya, is being attained, or better yet, maybe remembered. So we can look through this process of sampragata in this way. The mind, with gunas and nature present, expand towards freedom. So the mind's expansion here, like we like to chant in the peace chants like that. Apyayantu mamangani vak pranaschakshu shrotra matra balanamindriyani cha sarvani. So mamangani vak, speech, mind, everything gets taken up and dissolved inside by expansion. All these things might look very big inside of a non-expanded mind, but if you take the mind and start expanding it, they become smaller and smaller and smaller to where they're seen as just little particles of the cosmic process, like visheshas or avisheshas or tattvas. So the being with the expanded ego, the inflated ego, which is unhealthy, thinks all of these are the life to it. You see, my personality is life, my possessions are my life, my properties are my life, my wealth are my life, and so in this way everything is so big that there's no expansion of mind. But as soon as you start to expand the mind in yoga, these things begin to diminish and become smaller and smaller and smaller, less substantial, less important to you. You could see this even in the way that we hear that Sri Ramakrishna went into samadhi quite often, different levels of samadhi. Second point, rajas gets eliminated, intellect discriminates between matter and self. So the mind's restlessness is beginning attenuated more and more as this process kicks in. How else to say but to say that the gunas are still there, but they're there in a very subtle way. And nonetheless, they're going to suggest themselves on the mind again, like burnt strings, Sri Ramakrishna used to say. Some of these things will come back on the mind in this period where the mind is expanding to know Brahman. The mind must expand to know Brahman. It will forget everything else but Brahman, because Brahman is the only thing that exists, number one, and number two, it's the only thing worth knowing. And thou art that. The third point here is that the early stages of seated samadhi are encountered and attained. So we've gone back and we're taking this up towards a sampragata in a blow-by-blow way. I hope you understand. Then the final level of sampragata brings about Dharma mega samadhi. So this is where Patanjali talks about the rain cloud of virtues has been described as, or defined as. Defined that all of these great virtues have been inside you all along, and in some people it's been mounds of earth that have covered them, so to speak. In other beings, it's been lack of spiritual effort that's kept them from being realized. But as soon as a will to live a spiritual life based upon these principles occurs, then all of a sudden these upper limbs of yoga or these upper strata of Vedanta begin to reveal themselves to the aspiring seeker. And so it's just a matter of subtle veils falling away rather than mounds of earth that you have to dig and dig and dig and to try and find this gold of your true nature. And here's where then, of course, a place we all want to arrive at, Chitti Shakti illumines the buddhi. So here, take my intelligence, Mother, illumine it, please. And then the buddhi will become stable and desireless. So desires would be fast melting away when objects are seen what they are, when knowledge is attained, when wisdom is attained, and when bliss is attained. How can objects or anything stand as competitors when bliss is there? Because that's what people are seeking through objects, is bliss. So when they get that bliss without the objects, then nothing can compare to that bliss. This is saying the world cannot compare to God realization. And that has to be experienced for most people. But some people know it almost by rote. They're aware of that when they're born. That's why they're not comfortable in the body. They're not content with objects, with possessions. They don't take the world to be their oyster. I mean, you can go on listing all of these things. So for them, it's an easy way of just letting go one level after another. It's a natural renunciation that we saw in beings like Jesus and Buddha and Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. And we are talking about yoga here, by the way. So this is one of the 4 great yogas. I mean, we just had Swami Vivekananda's Mahasamadhi, didn't we? Last weekend, or last Monday. It was the 4th of July, day when he passed into his Mahasamadhi. And day after, 2 days after tomorrow, is Guru Purnima. So we have really 2 beautiful holy days that we can look at Swami Vivekananda as the bringer of yoga, because he brought us 4 yogas. So this is, we have the Raja Yoga commentary he did, which is really simplifying it for Westerners so that they can understand the yoga of the mind or the yoga of meditation. But we also have the Jnana Yoga that is needed to understand it, and the Bhakti Yoga that comes from it when one feels the bliss that begins to come out of the very self. And then one wants to share it in terms of Karma Yoga. So this is put in terms of like a way to express it through music. Vimoksham svatvanas chatir yoga dvabihi Pritagva samhatvair hitam lokasya cha Tavagya sadayediti priyanara Vivekanandate prabhate pranjalihi Narendra shashave Narendra yovane Narendra kridane Narendra shikshane Narendra harpane Narendra shavane Vivekanandate prabhate pranjalihi Vivekanandate prabhate pranjalihi Yatenurustava pranamam dashiti. And it flows on like that, verse after verse. All talking about Narendra, the perfect man, the perfect soul that has come here. So when we talk about Viveka and Vairagya, which is here on the chart, of course, as we go down, understanding these dissolution process of visheshas into avisheshas, and avisheshas into, well, we'll get to it soon, into a state of nirodha, then we think about great souls like Vivekananda who have come back to us to give commentaries on Patanjali's yoga, even though it was some 1700 years later, 1700 centuries passed, 17 centuries passed, and there they are, talking about each other's system again, and people singing about it to make sure that we don't forget to remember it. So when the Chit Shakti illumines the buddhi, then these gunas of prakriti are getting dissolved. So I just chanted that, Chitti Shakti hi, Va Chitti Shakti hi. She takes the soul and returns it, the transmigrating soul, returns it to its source. As she does, she strips away nature and gunas. She strips away name and form from nature, manifested prakriti, and gunas. They all begin to dissolve. So Father of Patanjali says that, and then now we have it here in this on this chart. So this is where the gunas of prakriti began to fall away. You might say that Thomas is really not in the picture here. Thomas has already gone away a long time ago. That is slothfulness. And only this kind of restlessness still is in the mind. And it's a more sattvic influenced restlessness. It's a more balanced restlessness. Like it can be restlessness to realize Brahman is a kind of restlessness. And in fact, people saw that in Vivekananda. Sometimes he'd pace, trying to think of how to bring these great teachings to everyone in the world, not just spiritual aspirants, but everyone. Bring this Vedanta back, a Neo-Vedanta, a new dispensation from the great master. So he would pace thinking about that, and then he'd stop, he'd have an epiphany about how he could cut time down and get people into meditation and get these teachings digested early so that one could be in bliss, and then one could go on. And as it just said here, and I didn't read the translation to it, did it? But it's good to hear it. O Vivekananda, your message, transmitted from the platform of non-duality, is for the realization of the soul and the good of the world. By reinterpreting and coalescing the four yogas and making them accessible and understandable to humanity, you have destroyed the foundation of ignorance in this age, ushered in a new era. In this auspicious dawn of illumination, O Vivekananda, we offer you our complete salutations, our complete surrender. So this 13 verses, one of which I just sang, was written in an ashram on retreat by a Swami who's still living. And so he wants everyone to know in this day and age that this great soul has come not just to bring one yoga, but to bring Chaturdasya Yoga, all four yogas, back into prominence, and how to connect them, or show us how they are connected, so that we can wake up and realize these connections. Live a life which is beneficial to us and to all others. So I was saying that tamas long before that, gets overcome. Rajas is still left in some form, but now sattva is beginning to dissolve. So the next point is the dissolution of sattva guna brings about the samprakyata samadhi. So when this enjoyment of the ego's bliss begins to subside, and it will, unless you get stuck there and have to do some more refining, maybe take a few steps back and do some more practices. But if sattva guna goes away and you're not attached to the bliss of individuality at all, even if it's a refined individuality, that's when the Chitti Shakti says, I'm going to strip gunas, name and form away from you now. You're not going to see nature anymore because you're the Purusha and that's the Prakriti. Some souls have this realization and they're gone and gone forever into that oceanic bliss of Brahman. But some souls have it. They also have the knowledge that Prakriti exists inside Purusha. That's a much more complete kind of realization. Rather than just seeing name and form and everything get stripped away from Prakriti and having the Chitti Shakti deliver you into the ocean like a hailstone, he says, Shankara says, like a hailstone in an ocean, where my mind fell into that oceanic bliss with its nectar-like swell of the Atman. My mind fell into that and dissolved completely. Beautiful, beautiful slokas in the Vivekachudamani, which we're looking at now. But some souls then will retain that remembrance that when she stripped Prakriti away, and the gunas away, and sattva dissolved into sattva shuddha, you might say, is how Vivekananda put it, then they remembered that all of that was in them. And some just renounced it and went away from it and had an unencumbered form of non-dual bliss. These others were meant to come back. That's where Sri Ramakrishna says, Divine Mother gives some beings Prema Bhakti, and she gives some beings Brahma Gyan. But to those who she wants to teach men, teach beings, she'll give them both. So that's that kind of soul that has that experience at the culmination and goes into Sampragata Samadhi and takes with them everything that they just saw dissolving. So now it's iti iti as compared to just neti neti. And so it's all this, not just not this, not this. Sure, you cast off the weights of not this, drop the sandbags from your hot air balloon and float it away into the highest elevations. But others retained the ability to come back into the lower elevations to help others. This is an ongoing teaching in the Dharma of India that is another additional facet to the beauty of Sanatana Dharma. Those are very important points right there in the middle. Chitti Shakti illumines the buddhi. The gunas of Prakriti get dissolved back to their origin. And the dissolution of the sattva guna brings about seedless samadhi. You'd think it stops there, but that's why I just explained to you how some beings see Prakriti dissolve back into them, not just dissolve into nothing. So now what happens? The Purusha now controls the mind's activities and is free from samsara. So the Purusha is now in control of all the visheshas and avisheshas and everything that it just dissolved back into the origins of them all, their respective origins. Then an attachment to matter ceases, but the intelligence, the buddhi, still conducts relations with matter and spirit. So they're seeing both Brahman and they're seeing the world. It's a bhavamukha kind of state that was a gift of Sri Ramakrishna because he remained in it quite a while. That shows beings both, shows that, if you want to put it this way, because one Swami did, Brahman is real, the world is also real. And we know the Vedanta Dindima, the conclusion of Vedanta is Brahman is real, the world's not real. So you better make sure to follow that dictum. Make sure you don't think that there's any abiding reality to the world when you don't realize Brahman, when you haven't realized Brahman yet. It's after you realize Brahman that the world is seen as Brahman, not until. And there's so many mistakes being made about this in the name of Advaita Vedanta. So many misunderstandings. I was fortunate to avoid them because I had Indian Swamis teaching me. I never had other teachers. I had only Indian Swamis taught me as my gurus this philosophy. And they made sure that my mind was divested and free of that kind of thinking. transformation had to go, as Brahman doesn't transform. And origination had to go, because everything's unoriginated. So if those two things are brought forward first and foremost, when you take on a great system like Advaita Vedanta and Vedanta at other stages, then you'll be free of those kinds of problems. You won't fall back into thinking that, oh, this is changing, or I'm not the unchanging Brahman. I have changes still left to go through. So I think this pretty much says it all here. When the mind's activities are free from samsara, you see. Attachment to matter ceases, but the intelligence still conducts relationships with matter and spirit. As you can see, all of these great souls that we admire have been doing that. And then the yogi interacts with the world, but the chit shakti within abides calmly despite appearances. That really describes in a somewhat less devotional way the condition of Sri Ramakrishna and his mother Kali, that he had offered everything at her feet, all his wisdom, his knowledge, his mantra practice, his mala, his students, his divine wife. He offered everything back to Mother Kali. That was his great secret, and the secret for his profound spiritual success, which the world still has to a great extent, understand. Now, let's see what, as a nice ending quote for this very important 8th strata step that we're looking at, see what Vedavyas says, the father of Vedanta, how he talks about the father of yoga system. He concludes it like this: when the mind field expands to know the underlying principles which support it, that is called vitarka. When it seeks a more refined expansion in order to comprehend the subtle supports behind appearances, that is known as vichara. When bliss is experienced upon knowing the gross and subtle, that is termed ananda, sattvic joy. And when the evidence of a unified self occurs, which allows the removal of all distinctions, that is known as ashmita. So he puts a very beautiful definition to these 4 seated samadhis after studying Father of Yoga system. Vedavyas had many incarnations, so this one that he's speaking from here came after Patanjali's incarnation at about 140 AD, and then Vedavyas commented on that beautiful 8-limbed Ashtanga Yoga and made conclusions like this in the discourses and scriptures. So I think although that took time and it took us deep into a very rarefied level of yoga samadhi, or samadhi overall, nonetheless we could have taken a lot of time to discuss that 8th limb, or that 8th strata we're calling it here. But instead we just looked at seated samadhis leading to this one samadhi and covered it all in one fell swoop. Now, I told you, and I went through it with you before, that I would lead you through these upper groups of teachings. So let's do that in the time remaining. On the left-hand side there will be challenges to mastering the will to live a spiritual life. I'm putting this is my own commentary, my own way of saying it, after looking at Western students of Vedanta, of yoga, Tantra, Samkhya, Buddhism, after observing the human race and in this day and time, and having students come and take these teachings, seeing what the results are over some 50 years now, then I would put it in terms of this kind of challenge that we have, that I see most people are coming up against. And some of them are making headway against it. A few are piercing through it, but it's slow going. And some of them are falling back completely into their old lives, old ways of thinking, by accosting some of these. A flavor through all of this, probably these 5 here, is ancestors. I mean, this whole side, from Lord Buddha on, who was 550 years prior to Jesus' appearance. That means about 700 years prior to Patanjali putting together his system. In terms of Lord Buddha, he was talking about, and he was already seeing, that the ancestors were forming a huge Granthi in India. Ancestor worship, ritualism, and all of that, he wasn't that big on, as we know. So, and personality worship he was not big on too, even for his own personality, which was worthy of worship. But in that sense, then you could see kind of overall echoes of that coming through these. Triumph over personal laziness, because you may have seen that in your families as you grew up, and you see it in society, and all of its different kinds of people. So the procrastination element, the putting things off, that's a challenge. And you can see where it would be in this will to live a spiritual life. So, like, I'm going to get up every day and meditate. Oops, what happened to that 2 months down the line? Or I'm going to do my mantra like my guru told me, and I'm going to do it to my last breath. Oops, what happened to that a few months later when I went to look for another guru and a couple more mantras to try out for a week to see if they worked. So I'm not just talking about the usual old slothfulness that attends upon people. Like I said, long before this was even introduced, there was tamas to bear and tamas to suffer. Tamas, of course, means slothfulness. So sloth is the rust of all beautiful things. That's a direct quote from Lord Buddha out of the Dhammapada, the first scripture of Buddhism. So personal laziness is monkey see, monkey do. We see that a lot. You're copying the giving up, the failures of people that you see who are also trying to face off against society's ills and failing, becoming bitter, and so forth. We could see it in our early family members. We could see it as they grew up, what they were trying to achieve, and having varied success and failure with that. So that's going to be something that you're going to have to throw in a bag and throw in a river. I'm quoting Vivekananda. Take everything that's in the way like that, put it in a bag, tie the bag up, take it, throw it into the river. Just don't throw it into the Karma Manasa River. As I was writing about that today in a God blog, Shankaracharya talking about, there's one river that flows through the world. It's called Karmanasa. You do not want to get into that river. That's tamas. I'm sorry, that's rajas. That's restlessness. It's the river of activities. So, I mean, he's warning you not to fall into that. You don't have to do your actions in that river. You can do your actions from the banks of that river. And that's a teaching that Buddha gave. Get out of the river, sit on the banks, watch everything go by. You'll be a much better judge of your direction, how to guide others, how to guide yourself. So anyway, a kind of running commentary on this triumph we need to make over that tendency to let anything rob us of our divine nature. Definitely not slothfulness, but also not restlessness. And restlessness pertains more to this day and age. I remember slothfulness used to pertain more when I was younger. I saw that in people. Now I see this crazy restlessness. It's just, and no balance. They want a palace and not peace. There's a God blog I wrote last week that you might have seen. Resist worldly family influences. It didn't say resist family influences, and it definitely didn't say resist dharmic family influences. You have a right to all of that. Hopefully that's a better world you've been born into, as Krishna says in the Gita, where you will be born in a dharmic family, or a family that's humble and modest, humble, that's chaste, and that's studying the Dharma. Or maybe into a family of yogis and yoginis. That's a birth very rare, he says in the Gita. And in this day and age, more so than in his times, probably. But resisting worldly family influences, worldliness, then the chronic disease of this age, according to Sri Ramakrishna. So definitely personal laziness and cause, and collective laziness is going to be a part of that. But this is a step deeper, is that you're actually beginning to separate yourself from having to march to the beat of the same old drummer that your parents and their parents marched to, and that the society is marching to. And if you wanted, to study yoga, first thing you'd give up would be violence. That's why we didn't go to war. We wouldn't let the government send us to war when I was a kid. We just, no. That's crazy what you're doing. It doesn't take a big brain to figure that out. It doesn't take a rebel. It doesn't take a revolutionary to figure out that what you're doing is not right. And you're not going to send me to it. So you take a stand against it early on, and they leave you alone because they don't want the trouble. They can go dupe other people by the thousands to go kill others. Religion can do that. Pope can put on a helmet and go kill all the Muslims he wants and call it religion. That's irreligion. So we just say no to those sorts of things. So if it hasn't become perfectly crystal clear to you what yoga is, according to the right ways of context, just go back and study the 5 yamas and niyamas and ask yourself, am I following them? Am I being honest in my speech, satya? Am I giving up coveting the goods of others, asteya? Am I being moderate in my sensual appetites, continence, brahmacharya it's called? And am I studying the scriptures with the help of a guru, swadhyaya? Am I memorizing slokas? See what you're doing and what you're not doing, and then step up, and if you have to say no to government, irreligion, society, and your very own father and mother, then you have a right to do that if they're blocking you from attaining enlightenment. This is what they're keeping you from. What I just spent a half hour, 40 minutes on, that's what they're keeping you from. Your own bliss. The right to be one with Brahman. They want everything else but that. Stand firm against conventions. You can see how all of these kind of follow in turn. Conventions, and then would lead you on towards particularly religious convention, mundane religious convention that's not teaching you the Dharma, that's not trying to free you, but rather trying to bind you, that's keeping you from non-dual realization and keeping you into sort of a fundamental dualism. These are all things that you then have a right to say no to, and for the best health of your spiritual life, you back off from them and you march to the beat of a different drummer. Start marching, start dancing to Divine Mother's tune, not Maya's tune, like everyone else. And here's where then we assume that you have a practice, you see. Maintain the pace of your practice. So this is back to what we were saying, that if Tamas comes sneaking back in, or Rajas won't go away, and Sattva becomes something that you're clinging to, and not going on to let it go too, then you can say, I haven't kept up with the pace of my practice because my goal was nirvana, was kaivalya, was samadhi, was freedom, was the realization of Brahman, was oneness with God. But however you want to say that, that was the goal at the very beginning, why I took up a practice, and I cannot flag anymore, cannot drag my feet or draw back. So I increase and intensify my practice. And I have plenty of practices now, because my guru is rattling on and on forever, for decades, about the philosophy and how important it is and how to follow the tradition. I don't know how many times I heard that from Swami Sheshananda Maharaj, peace and bliss be upon him, from my guru there. Follow the tradition. Pick up one tradition, Patanjali says, Vedavyas says, copulist says, and follow that tradition, being a good one, with a guru, until you reach the essence of that realization. Then that one great river will lead you to the ocean. And that's basically going to be fortified by your will to live a spiritual life. As we are beginning to wrap up, as you can tell, some of this. Turn wealth towards spiritual growth. So you can see how I chose family, wealth, irreligion or conventional religion, and one's personal heaviness, tamas, as my choice of things to put forth as challenges to the will of attaining even just this fourth strata. Because if you can push on from there, then these will come naturally. You've cut off the sandbags off of your air balloon mind, and natural buoyancy will happen, and you'll have Chit Shakti herself, Chitti Shakti herself, sending you a guru, sending you a sangha. Well, let's get to that next, because that's over on the other side. There will be victories to gain in the will to live a spiritual life. And that would be worship daily with devotion. I have had even more evidence of Sri Krishna's teaching of one of the greatest physical austerities to do. It's not asana. It's not fasting. He doesn't mention those in the Gita. He mentions worship as the hardest physical austerity to do. So when you get old, like I saw my teacher get old, bend down on 90-year-old knees to offer a flower to the mother, that's difficult. You won't know until it comes upon you. So to do your daily worship, to do your Shiva puja, to do your practice in front of the altar, your meditation every day, all of these things are very difficult to do, and they need to be done further with devotion intact, not just because someone told you to, or maybe because you are trying to prove something to yourself and to others, but because you have that natural devotion to God that we saw in Sri Ramakrishna. They want you to study the scriptures intelligently, not just read them and walk away. Bounce the teachings off of a guru daily is best of all. Holy Mother said if you can live close to the guru and go see the guru every day and do this swadhyaya, this study of Jnana Yoga, and have the questions come up and then go talk to the guru. In this day and age, of course, it can be done through phones, through seminars, through email. There are ways that you can do it. In the old days, you could have written letters and posted them and waited for the answers to come back. In whatever case, though, the study of scriptures is one of the greatest of all aids to enlightenment. Thinking of the four yogas, so if you have meditation, if you put that first, a lot of people are doing that nowadays. I think sometimes it's not such a good idea, but put meditation first. Your meditations will be best if you have studied the scriptures before you sit down and you continue doing that. It'll be best if you have done your worship before you sit down to meditate. It'll be done best if you have served God and other beings before you sit down to meditate. So these three yogas, if they're said to accompany meditation, then that's how you would put together the four yogas in an intelligent way. All right, well, let's say, well, actually, I'm more studious. I want to put Jnana Yoga first. So then what am I going to have to do to make Jnana Yoga mature the fastest? By putting these other three yogas, and so forth and so forth. If you're a bhakta, then your bhakti is going to be much more thorough. Your reading and understanding of the Gita is going to be much more thorough if you know what Krishna is talking about when he talks about Jnanam, because it's in the title of most of the chapters. The word Jnanam is there all the time. And karma, too, service and so forth. So in that way, an explication of this important concomitant to your practice. Then serve and question the Guru. Support and inspire the Sangha, and adhere to the non-dual perspective. And that reminds me of how I wanted to end this series. As we run out of time, I had a couple other charts to show you. One on wealth and how wealth plays into the support as well as the detraction of spiritual life. But since we've just gone through these 10 challenges and victories to the will to live a spiritual life, basing it all on that, then I wanted to show you what a tantric aspirant does every day, and how beautiful the system is when you're an adhikari. See up the, isn't that what it says here? Tantra Shastra Adhikari. See, so this is a qualified. Adhikari means to be qualified, because you have studied the Shastras and the Tantras, and so that makes you qualified to be an actual aspirant for truth, to attain the highest truth. So the way they put this in Tantra is 7 qualifications. Be very, very good, and it's almost picking it up right from where we left off here, to be intelligent. So daksha means intelligence. So I would say that, and I don't have to guess about this, I've actually seen it, not just in my own case, but in watching our founder, Lex Hickson, teach aspiring Vedantists and Sufis when he became a sheikh in Sufism, is that you can look at a group of people and see the ones that are shining with intelligence, and you can see the ones whose intelligence are still dim. You can see the ones who haven't even awakened to intelligence yet. And this doesn't mean they don't have other qualities, like I was just saying, like maybe they're bhaktas, or maybe they're good meditators. But this daksha is put first in Tantra, because if you have that, you can make such swift progress through every yoga. That intelligence is mother's own buddhi. You see, we just looked at how it was mentioned in this Sampradaya chart so many times, the buddhi, and how it grows and how it detaches itself from the ego at one point, and how it begins to understand the difference between knowledge and wisdom, and how it begins to attach itself towards truth, and until finally knowledge, knower, and what's to be known disappear or merge. And that was what put you into non-dual samadhi. See, that was that place, along with Chitti Shakti's appearance through intelligence, is what put you there. So if you look at it, it's just so stunning, and it makes this a very good system to look at in terms of daksha, or intelligence. Let's go down the left-hand side. Sauchi. Shuchi, pure of heart. So that's also one of the yamas and niyamas, saucha. You might see how Tantra, Vedanta, Yoga, Samkhya, and Buddhism and so forth also have so many teachings that are just similar to one another. And they may interpret them or place them in a different order of practice, but nonetheless they're all there. So in this case, they're not just calling it purity on the moral level, you know, like a yama or a niyama, but saying you should be pure of heart. So this is what I was saying yesterday at satsang, is that many people who are, and probably the intelligent ones would be among them, are in love with the very idea of love. So prema is very important to them. That's why they came here. And maybe you're looking for love in all the wrong places when you come here, to borrow from a song. But nonetheless, if you're a lover of divine reality, as our founder Lex Hickson used to like to use that phrase, then you won't be satisfied and rest until you come to find that divine reality. And you'll find it in the hearts of others, in the hearts of holy men and holy women, of course. So if you find that, then you've pretty much reached the divine atmosphere upon which you can conclude your life's business. See, all the karmas can be dissolved, all your goals can be resolved, and all of these higher experiences of spirituality can be fully attained inside of love. So purity of heart is going to be a great qualification of the adhicari or adhikari. Jitendriya, we know when we hear that word, indriya, it means senses. So you must master those senses. As you can see by, or hear, by listening to Dharma discourses over years, is that there aren't just 5 of those, but there's 10. And so when you step into Indian Dharma, you immediately have to account for the inner. You can't be happy with the outer anymore. You've been happy with the external things too long, and you haven't known that there's an origin to them that's within you. Kingdom of heaven is within you, all knowledge lies within you. Take Jesus's or Patanjali's words for it, because that's who I'm quoting. So all of a sudden, you're caught up short and say, you mean there's more than just this? Even in a sattvic level, that I've mastered my outer world. That's called mastering the A of Om in my tradition. But you haven't mastered the U of Om yet, and the M of Om yet. So your waking state can be quite lavish and happy and full of enjoyment and everything, but you have no idea of where that originates from, where that happiness originates. Didn't we just see that? You see, when we went through the seated samadhis, how the ego becomes enamored of its own bliss. Before that, it had no idea it was coming from inside of it. Like the deer doesn't know where the scent of musk is coming from when it runs around the forest. Just like that, the soul has no idea where this bliss is coming from. And when it does, that's just the first step of it, or third or fourth step of a seated samadhi, leading to something that's much more profound. So then what I'm saying here is Jitendriya is mastery of the senses, but you'll have to connect the outer senses of tasting, touching, hearing, seeing, and smelling to the inner senses in dream or in inner vision, in any kind of an inner experience, inner philosophy, inner study. That's why you started off with study of scriptures, for instance. It's one of the important things that happens to you, probably even before the will to live a spiritual life, but definitely after. Because if you've determined that this is your path, say Vedanta and Jnanam and all that, then you want to know deeper after you've concluded all of those doubts, as Patanjali just said. When those doubts are still there, it's still an early samadhi with objects. When you connect the outer to the internal, oh, the doubts went away. You see, now I know where the source of things are. The deer stops in the forest, smells its own navel. Wow, I smell great. So the person finds their connection to the Atman through their ripened ego. And it would all start with dissolving the outer senses into the inner senses, and the outer elements into the tanmatras. So basically, what to speak of 5, 10, now you've got 20 things that you can look at. And that's your homework as a spiritual aspirant, as you approach real samadhi, not pretend samadhi, intoxicant samadhi, or any other kind of samadhi that they're talking about. When the tantric master sees the tantric adept, he wants him to be sarvahimsam, nirvimukta. That is, sarvahimsa, completely nonviolent. Not just ahimsa, nonviolent. Sarvahimsa, he wants him to be completely nonviolent. He doesn't want to see an ounce of viciousness or violence or even the thought of that inside of them. They have to have determined that I will not harm a hair on that person's head in thought, word, or deed. And maybe it could even go so far as, I don't think I'll eat those animals, or I don't think I'll raise that forest, or I don't think I'll pollute that water, or any other more cogent and natural part of your intelligence that's telling you, don't do that. So we go back and look at them all again. You see, family, ancestors, all these things. Don't do those things. Just give it up. Who's holding you back? You're a grown boy now. You see, you're a mature woman. Why continue to hold on to things that aren't true, aren't real, aren't beneficial to others? So sarvahimsa, absolutely peaceful and nonviolent. Dvaitahina on the upper right hand. As we've just run out of time, I'm going to keep you a few minutes longer. Advaitahina means a non-violent. Advaita is non-violent. So you must have gone beyond just Dvaita, being a dualist. And this is going to be something that they look for too. Oh, it's got a mind that's thinking towards non-duality. That's very good. I don't have to teach him that, later. Surprise him with it. Guess what? All of this is unreal or anything. And now all I have to do is lead him in that general direction toward this oneness that he or she is feeling deep within them, and which they've always felt they've known ever since they drew a first breath, came out of the light into the darkness of this world, and which they will give up the darkness of this world to enter back into the light of Brahman again in a perfectly non-violent and a perfectly non-dual way. Their path is non-duality, and we're getting to that. Ashtaka means devotion to the scriptures, particularly the traditional ones. This is where you can see Tantra and Vedanta as two rivers, as I've always said, running side by side, sometimes merging. That is deity worship, your worship and your practice and everything that you did, with this great jnanam and knowledge, these great truths that are flowing in the river of Vedanta. These two merge, and this is where the four yogas say, hey, we have a chance here to come back in this age. Who are we going to call? Who are you going to call? Swami Vivekananda is who you're going to call, because it's time for these two rivers to meet and all four yogas to come back into focus. So devotion to those scriptures is going to be the sixth, maybe penultimate. So you see what a beautiful wheel this is. See, this is Konark. This is in South India, or not South India. It's in temple, and it's a sandstone wheel that's got temple around it, deities and so forth that I just called out. So it's got all of these beautiful teachings of the Dharma in one completely perfect dharmic wheel. And so this other thing came up, this last quality or qualification came up in our seminar 2 weeks ago, and we talked about it. Brahmanista, Brahmavadi, Brahmaparayana. Faith, path, and refuge in God. It pretty much covers it all. Nista means one-pointed devotion to your ishtam. Vadi means a path that you follow. So the path has to be one that, just here, devotion to the scriptures and so forth, and non-duality and so forth, is so much a part of your path that there's no way that you could not see that fact or follow that path. Vadi, Brahmavadi. It's leading me to Brahman. These are Brahman's very footprints, the footfalls of Brahman, of great souls who walk through this world. All I need to do is see them and follow them to the goal, and it's that easy. And it will be easier if my refuge is in Brahman to Parayana. So great slokas come to mind when I think of that, taking refuge in God. So that we had just enough time really to show this as a kind of overall chart, particularly for the 5 on the right-hand side. I already gave kind of a running commentary for the ones on the left. So here maybe I should let you all return to your refuge in Brahman and your path in Brahman and your one-pointed love of Brahman. And then we'll come back next week, next Sunday, to look at how important the memory is in this smriti. Can we keep it divine? Can we recover it? Or is it going to remain forgotten to us that the memory is of a divine nature? It might as well be the heart of the Atman, is this divine memory. Daiva Smriti it's called. So we'll look at that next week. Om Masajam Malamanta Nuttina Malaganta Malavanasa Kusajam Pamado Rakato Malam. Om peace, peace, peace. Negligence is the problem of the watchman at the city gate. Sloth is the rust of all good and beautiful things. Non-recitation of scriptures is the rust of monasteries. And non-self-effort is the rust of households. Therefore, may we always and ever be like watchmen at the gate of the great city of Brahman, attaining to the highest state of Brahman. Om peace, peace, peace. May peace be unto us. May peace be unto all. Om Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om Tat Sat.